Welcome back to Politics HQ. Thanks for tuning in. Now it's time for The Big Idea. This is the segment where somebody joins us in the studio and gives us their pitch on a big idea for a better Australia. This is where it gets really interesting. You, the viewer, get the chance to vote on it at home. You don't have to just sit there and yell at me or yell at people on the screen. You can actually make your voice heard by going online and casting a vote. And at the end of the show, we'll let you know what the results are. And you can do that by going onto Twitter, going to the Twitter handle @Sky News Australia, and at the top of the screen there's a Twitter poll there which you can make your voice heard on. Now tonight's big idea, we examine what the Turnbull government's top budget priority should be in 2018. Should it be cutting income taxes? Should it be cutting corporate taxes? Or should the focus be on balancing the budget? Here to give us his pitch on these options is Daniel Wild, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He joins us tonight in Melbourne. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Nicholas.
Glad you could join us. Well, Daniel, this is a big topic. You've got the soapbox. Give us your pitch on what the Turnbull government's budget priority should be.
Well, Nicholas, I think the government's priorities should be all three of those. It should be cutting taxes, cutting both income and corporate tax, and to balance the budget, it needs to be cutting spending. Because if you cut taxes without cutting spending, all you're doing is adding to the debt, and that will just be passed on to future generations. And so what they need to be doing is reducing the corporate tax. We have a very high reliance on the corporate tax and also a very high reliance on the personal income tax. Both of those taxes are very destructive of wealth. We have the second highest reliance on corporate tax as a percentage of GDP, second only to Norway, and the second highest reliance as a percentage of overall revenue from income tax to Denmark. So reducing our reliance on those taxes and cutting the overall tax burden is absolutely essential. But the government also needs to make sure that it's running a balanced budget and moving towards a budget surplus and paying down debt. And to do that, it must be reducing spending. And the best way to cut spending is to get the Commonwealth out of the areas that have been traditionally and better handled by state governments. That means reducing or eliminating the Commonwealth from education, from health, from environmental regulation, and reducing its role in infrastructure and natural resource management. So we can cut taxes, cut spending, get the budget back under control, and that's going to be great for business investment, for job creation, and making Australia a more prosperous place, and reducing the amount of debt and deficit that we currently have.
All right, Daniel, that was a very spirited pitch for small government in Australia. Got a couple of policy and political experts who we're going to bring in to help pull it apart. So let me bring into this conversation Andrea Carson, who's a former media advisor to Bill Shorten and now a political scientist at the University of Melbourne, and Parnell McGuinness, who is the managing director of Thoughtbroker, who are advocates and communication experts for business and industry groups. Welcome, Andrea. Welcome, Parnell.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Andrea, I think we'll let you go first with this one. What do you think of Daniel's pitch?
Well, first of all, I'd like to hear Daniel say a little bit about trying to get those who aren't paying the taxes they should be paying to be paying it. And here I'm singling out the multinationals. A study by Berkeley shows that 10% of individuals are not paying the taxes that they should be across the globe, and that money is going to offshore accounts. In Australia, a study last year by Oxfam found $6 billion in revenue to the Commonwealth government wasn't going there because it was going offshore, and this was multinationals that were based in Australia, not multinationals that operate in Australia that don't have their base here. So first of all, before we talk about cutting any taxes, I think we should be talking about getting those who should be paying taxes to be paying the right amount. The other thing that I didn't hear in Daniel's speech there was about our ageing population, and with an ageing population comes service provision, particularly for hospitals, and who's going to pay this if he is going to give everyone a spending cut? It might be a great political strategy if you're running for office, but it's not so good for keeping those services running that are essential to good health in a democracy such as Australia's.
Daniel would like to respond to that, reforming the tax base to make big companies in particular pay their fair share. And how do you answer claims that you cut taxes, you inevitably have to cut services?
Well, look, I don't accept the implicit assumption of that statement or that assertion, because it presupposes that we can only judge the value of a business by the amount of tax that they pay, and I just don't accept that. Businesses are important because they create jobs, and if you want to have more jobs, you need to have more job creators. Australia is a very hostile country when it comes to its treatment of businesses. We're a very high tax nation, as I mentioned, but we're also imposing a lot of regulatory impositions on businesses. We have a massive red tape problem in Australia. It costs $176 billion each year, and this is one of the key causes as to why business investment is today, as a percentage of GDP, lower than under the Whitlam government, which is a very economically hostile period in Australia's history. So Australia needs to be reducing the burden on businesses, reducing the tax burden, the regulatory burden, the red tape burden, because we need more business investment, because, as I said, this is where jobs come from and it's where wages growth come from. And we know that there's a slump in wages. Real wages in the private sector have actually been going backwards in some sectors and in some industries. And one of the key reasons for that is because we have high taxes and high regulation. We should be reducing those to encourage more competition and more investment.
Parnell, I can sense that you're bristling to jump into this debate. Got any opening questions for Daniel on what the priority for the Turnbull budget should be? Cutting income taxes, cutting corporate taxes, or balancing the budget?
Yeah, Daniel, look, as you probably know, I agree philosophically with most of that, but I do wonder what you would think about making this palatable from a political perspective. How do you go about getting a bit of quid pro quo, say, from the people who you are giving tax cuts to, say, saying, OK, we're going to be cutting back in this area of service delivery, but for that you'll have more money in your pocket to pay for whatever you want to yourself? Or from a corporate perspective, we're going to be cutting that corporate tax rate to make things easier for you to compete globally, but that might mean that there are also some regulations unwound that prevent other entrants into the market.
That's a really important point, an important question, because one of the main issues we have with regulatory reform, just to pick up on your last point, is that big businesses, the best friend of regulation is big business, because they like the fact that it keeps competitors out of the market. And that's a big problem in Australia, because we have a number of sectors which are really oligopolies, a small number of large firms, whether it's finance, telecommunications, airlines. These are all dominated by a small number of big players, and they want to keep competitors out. And that's a big problem, because they ask government for favours. It's really crony capitalism, not capitalism, that's playing here. And reducing the amount of interaction and lobbying that goes on between businesses and government is really important. In terms of how you communicate this, it's a matter of leadership. We have serious economic problems, $725 billion in gross debt by the middle of next decade. All that's going to be paid by the next generation of Australians. And I think the Abbott government's first budget was a reasonably good attempt to try and address these issues. It was unsuccessful, but it was pitched in the right way, which was to say this is a budget which is there for all Australians, is to ensure that we can have a prosperous future and ensure that our budget can be sustainable into the future. So having leadership and communicating the reality of our economic and financial situation is really important.
So, Daniel, surely you would advocate for a balanced approach to repairing the budget, though. I mean, I think we'd all agree that the scope for savings in the budget, things could be done better. But, slashing $65 billion in company taxes, as is proposed by the Turnbull government, is inevitably going to have an impact on services in a way which is detrimental. I mean, don't you think there's a balanced approach which says, yes, trim spending, but also, the revenue side has got to do its job as well?
Well, I think the approach I have outlined is a balanced approach, and the idea that when you're taking less money from other people, that's slashing a spending item is just wrong, because it's not the government's money to start with. Individuals and families and workers and businesses own their own pre-tax income, not the government. If the government owned our pre-tax income, we'd be in servitude, and we're not. We're in a free country with free people. The government takes our money, share our income every year, and so we need to be reducing the amount of money that the government is expropriating off others. And the growth of government since the 1960s has been, it's just continued year after year, and we've got the point now where it's quite unsustainable. Like I said, $725 billion in gross debt that's been passed on to the next generation. I think a balanced approach would recognise the fact that we're unfairly burdening the next generation with a very high tax burden, and we need to be reducing spending now fairly dramatically in order to ensure that debt starts to come down.
Okay, Andrea?
Well, I'm a little surprised to hear from Daniel that he thought the 2014 Abbott budget was a good one. There was 12 months of commentary that followed that showed that most people didn't agree with that proposition. I also thought that I'm not hearing much of a consideration for Google and for Apple and all those multinationals that are paying very low levels of tax in Australia but are happy to do trade here, and how that might go into this idea of how we can increase revenue for all Australians by getting those who aren't paying their proper share of tax to start pitching in and giving Australians what is rightfully theirs through the
what would be their proper share
levels.
Though? How much more should they be paying now than
They
they're
should
already
be paying what the corporate tax rate is, rather than putting their money into offshore accounts, which is legal but has a big question mark on the morality of it.
Well, I mean, the issue is if we start hitting firms that are competing across nation states, across global markets with higher taxes, then they're just not going to invest here. So it's not even clear to me that
Daniel,
if you
that's
did raise,
ludicrous.
and if you did
Apple
start,
is not going to stop selling its products in Australia just because you make them pay the right amount of tax.
I guess
if you raise taxes on a business, it is going to have a negative effect on the businesses that are going to invest here. It's not just directly on the ones that you're trying to hit. You might go after Google, you might go after Apple, you might go after the big multinationals, but that's going to send a signal to other businesses that might want to invest in this country that the government is going to go after you when you start making a profit. Like I said, these businesses can't just be judged by the amount of tax they pay. They're judged by the services they provide, the jobs that they create, and all the conveniences they provide for us. The fact that we have such a convenient modern economy with the